Nobody warned me that being a nurse in a war meant learning more about silence than about healing. People say time heals everything, but that's just a comforting lie told by those who've never felt real pain. I held on to a secret for decades, a secret that was ripped from my arms with a promise of honor and silence. And if I'm here today, it's because sometimes silence weighs heavier than the past itself. When I shipped out to care for the wounded in Italy, I thought the worst thing I'd see would be broken bodies, burned flesh, men screaming for mercy. But I was wrong. The worst part isn't what war does to the body. It's what it does to the heart. And my heart, in that cold place, stumbled into a forbidden love that turned my whole life upside down. I carried a pregnancy through bombs, judgment, and crushing loneliness, until they gave me an impossible choice. Forget my child to protect their dignity. Theirs, of course, not mine. If you've ever carried a secret you weren't allowed to share, if you've ever been forced to silence something that was bigger than you, or if you've ever learned firsthand that some wounds don't fade with time, then sit here with me, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just another war story. It's the emotional story of how, when they made me promise silence in exchange for my child, they ended up teaching me a lesson the world still hasn't understood. The only way to heal silence is to give voice to what they tried to erase. My name is Bernice Violet Adams. I'm 91 years old, and I live in an old red brick house in South Baltimore. It's small, but it holds too many memories. So many that sometimes there's barely any room left for me. I cook on a wood-burning stove, still wear my stained apron, and spend most of my days in a straw chair by the kitchen window. From here I watch the trees on the street sway in the wind like they're waving at me. On my face and arms I carry vitiligo, marks left by time and war, like my skin learned to forget in pieces. I was a nurse during World War II. I was just in my 20s when they sent me to care for burned soldiers on the Italian front, back in 1944. That wasn't a hospital. It was a trench draped in sheets. It smelled like ether and gunpowder. Screams came from faceless mouths. Eyes begged me for something not even God seemed willing to give. But in that war, I also received something no one expected, something that cost me years of silence. Today, for the first time, I'm opening up that story. But I want you to enter it slowly. Take a deep breath. Sit with me here like you were my granddaughter, or my daughter. Yes, this is a war story, but it's also a story about love, about choices, and about a secret I still keep locked inside a metal box, sealed with the key to my own conscience. If you feel this story touched you, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it too, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's go back. Naples didn't smell like war. It smelled like burned flesh. And before you start thinking bonfires or barbecues, let me be clear. I mean human flesh. The flesh of young men, boys, brothers once held in a mother's arms, now nothing more than shadows under white sheets. It was a smell that clung to the back of your nose, mixing with the ether, the dried blood on the bandages, and the sour milk from the mess hall. War has many sounds, bombs, gunfire, screams. But before all that, it has a smell, and that was the first one I ever learned to recognize. I was just 23 when I was assigned as an assistant nurse in the advanced burn ward on the Italian front. There was no time to cry, no time to ask questions. We just followed orders. My uniform, which started out white like hope, turned the color of rust, stained with fluids and promises no one intended to keep. I slept on a stiff bunk with a straw pillow, packed into a tent with 6 other women. But sleeping was just a figure of speech. We only closed our eyes to try and block out the sounds. And when the bombs came, everything shook, even the bones of our faith. It was there, in that scene stitched together with tarp and tin soup cans used to boil syringes, that I heard the sound that shook me more than anything else during the war. A piano. That's right. An old cracked wooden piano. Someone, maybe a soldier, maybe an angel in disguise, had stashed behind the makeshift mess hall. No one knew who played it, or how it had survived the humidity. But every afternoon, just as the sun began to sink behind the field hospital, a melody would drift through the air. It was always the same one, Moonlight Serenade. Glenn Miller, if memory serves me. It felt like a miracle floating through the screams. I started sneaking out when I heard the first notes. I couldn't stay long. There were dressings to change, buckets to empty, soldiers to comfort. But those 3 minutes of music felt like a sip of water in the middle of a desert. And it was during one of those small escapes that I saw him, leaning against the wall, with half his face wrapped in thick gauze, and his hands blistered and peeling. There he was, the man who'd later teach me that some secrets don't burn. They set you on fire from the inside out. His name was Joseph Langston. He was from Alabama. Tall frame, broad shoulders, and a voice so rough it sounded like it had been carved out of flame. But what struck me that first time wasn't how he looked. It was the calm way he listened to the piano. Like the music wasn't just sound, but a bridge. Like he was visiting some place only he knew existed. He looked at me like someone who recognizes a pain that hasn't been named yet. And he smiled. Not a big smile. Just the corner of his mouth lifting, saying more than words ever could. "You like Glenn Miller?" he asked. I nodded. My mom used to play this on hot nights before the war. Before everything turned to smoke, he added. Then he went quiet. We both did, sitting there with the music between us. That was the first time someone spoke to me about war, without saying the word war. After that, I started noticing whenever he showed up by the piano. He never played, just listened. Always the same way. Bandage on his face, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on something that wasn't there. One day I brought him a mug of broth, pretending it was a casual gesture. But it wasn't. It was an excuse. He took it and thanked me with a soft, "Thanks, nurse." But he didn't say my name. Didn't ask for it either. And I didn't ask for his. Because there were already too many things between us in that moment. None of them needing a name. The burn ward was hell itself. The heat inside the tents. The lack of anesthesia. The screams clenched between teeth. It felt like we were living inside a never-ending war story. Sometimes the soldiers cried out for their mothers, sometimes for God, and some just groaned with their eyes, their faces lost to pain. Taking care of them was more than a job. It was like holding a secret in your hands, a secret that bled. But Joseph was different. He helped others, even while injured. He hummed lullabies to an 18-year-old boy who'd lost his fingers. He talked a Canadian soldier out of ripping out his tubes. And every time I walked by, he'd look at me like he was saying, "We're still here." That look held me, pulled me in. It was like war had opened a crack, a moment where humanity still lived, where a nurse and a patient could just be two souls trying not to drown. One night, after a fire tore through part of the camp, the wounded came pouring in like a flood. I went 37 hours without sitting down. I stitched wounds, wiped empty eyes, gave morphine to those screaming in agony. And when dawn finally tinted the canvas ceiling a pale orange, I collapsed in a corner of the mess hall. That's when I heard it again. The piano. Faint, but steady. And between the notes, his voice. "You still hear it?" I lifted my head. There he was, with a blanket around his shoulders and hollow eyes, offering me a piece of peace in the middle of chaos. "The music only plays when you're near," he said. "Maybe you're the one who brings it." I smiled. And right then, without knowing, a new war story began. One that wouldn't make it into any book, but would be stitched forever into my skin. Some voices aren't heard with the ears. They come from inside. They touch a place in you that you didn't even know existed, until someone lights it up. Joseph's voice was like that. It wasn't beautiful in the usual sense. It was raspy, cracked in places like it had choked on smoke more than once, but it was steady, and in a way I'd only come to understand much later. It soothed. That voice didn't ask for anything. It just lingered, blowing through the war like a warm breeze. The first time I really heard him sing was on a muggy September afternoon. The canvas roof of the tent felt like it was melting. Flies buzzed everywhere. I was leaning over a young French soldier, treating a graft that had started to go bad. The smell was the same as always: iron, pus, flesh trying to stay alive. And then, between one breath and the next, Joseph started to sing. It was a song I knew. "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." That old spiritual my grandmother used to hum whenever someone in the family was slipping away. But Joseph didn't sing it like a dirge. He sang it like a cradle song, like he was holding someone's hand just before they let go. The French boy closed his eyes, and for the first time since he arrived, he stopped shaking. I froze. I looked at Joseph. He was sitting in a wheelchair in the corner of the tent, blistered fingers tapping gently on the armrest, keeping time. The sunset cast a shadow across the bandaged side of his face, and his eyes. His eyes had that strange shine people get when they've seen too much, and still choose to stay soft. There was tenderness in that song, a rare kind of tenderness you didn't see among soldiers or nurses. Maybe because too much tenderness in war is a risk. But he took that risk. In the days that followed, he sang more. Sometimes just a verse, sometimes a whole song. I noticed how the patients calmed down when he was nearby. Even Lieutenant Daniels, who'd lost part of his face and screamed every night, slept 3 nights in a row after Joseph quietly sang him a lullaby from Alabama. And that's when it hit me. Something I didn't want to admit. His voice put out a kind of fire none of our tools could touch. Because the cruelest fire of war wasn't the one from bombs. It was the one in the soul. I started looking for him with my eyes. I never said anything. Neither did he. But there was a code between us. A presence. When I'd enter the ward, he'd lift his head. Sometimes just one glance told me someone needed comfort. Other times it was him. And I'd stay by his bed, changing dressings, listening to made-up stories, or just breathing beside him. He told me that before the war, he worked in a mechanic's shop, that he was the middle child of 6, that his mother died of pneumonia, and his father was never good with words, but was an honest man. And he told me that when he got drafted, he thought about running. But how could I explain that to my brothers? Or to myself? He said. One night, after a botched evacuation, we lost 3 soldiers. 3. All burned beyond what a body can handle. I spent hours scrubbing the floor, not because it needed it, but because I couldn't stop. My hands burned from scrubbing. Joseph showed up in the doorway. He didn't say a word, just handed me a clean cloth. Then he sat beside me. We both scrubbed a kind of guilt water could never wash away. After that, he started calling me B. He never asked if he could. He just did. And I let him. Because in that war, where so many names were wiped from dog tags and letters that never arrived, having a nickname felt like a luxury, a sign that you were still a whole person to someone. And that gave me something I didn't even know I'd been missing. A place, belonging. Like my war story, the one that hurt from the inside, had finally found shelter in his voice. One morning, while I was changing the bandages on his chest, his skin fresh and fragile like raw silk, he asked me softly, "You dream about anything after all this, Bea?" I hesitated, didn't know if I could answer, didn't even know if I should. But I did. "I dream of silence," I said. "Of a house where the loudest sound is a kettle whistling on the stove." He smiled. "I dream of a rocking chair," he said, "and of a woman who loves jazz and lets me sing to her even when my voice gives out." We sat in silence for a while. Then he added, "I sing so you remember there's still music in the world, even when the world tries to convince you there isn't." And that stayed with me, like a seed planted deep in my chest. It was the first time since I'd arrived in Italy that someone offered me hope without obligation. He gave it like handing me a flower in the middle of a minefield. In the days that followed, I started noticing the sounds of war less. Not because they lessened, but because somehow his voice built an invisible wall between me and the chaos. When I cared for other soldiers, I thought of his melody. When I woke up drenched in sweat, I heard his low voice in my mind saying, "Breathe, Bea. It'll pass." It was like war had failed to destroy me completely, because in that field hospital, I'd found something it couldn't take: affection. But war, like any wild creature, can smell when something good is blooming. And when it senses you found something too beautiful among the wreckage, it prepares itself, because war can't stand to see flowers growing in scorched earth. And that autumn, when the winds began to shift, the piano's sound changed too, and with it, everything I thought could or couldn't survive the fire. I had already learned to recognize the sound of bombings before they arrived. It was like the air itself held its breath. The silence between heartbeats in camp would warn us. Something bad was coming. And that night, the warning was loud and clear. The wind stopped. The lanterns swayed. Then the blast. So close the ground shook under my bare feet. The infirmary top flew up like skin torn from bone. Screams, dust, metal. The war had barged into the place we tried so hard to call a refuge. I was in the corridor between the tents when everything went black. The generator died. Someone fell on me. There was blood. I don't know if it was his or mine. Someone shouted my name, but I didn't recognize the voice. I ran blindly until I reached the old storage behind the mess tent. It was sort of a makeshift basement where we kept dry blankets and dressing paper. It was dark, damp, but in there I could breathe. When I shut the door, I slid down to the floor. That's when I heard it. His breathing. Low, steady. From the other corner. "Bea?" he said, like my name had escaped the fear. "Joseph," I replied. And at that moment, knowing he was there was the most alive I'd felt since I set foot in Italy. Moonlight slipped through a small crack in the rotting wood. Just enough for me to see he was hurt again. A cut on his arm. Dust in his hair. Eyes still lit, even in the dark. He crawled over to me and handed me a folded sheet. Half for me, half for him. "Here," he said. "We'll share it, like everything else around here." We sat side by side, backs to the wall. The sound of bombs faded, like time itself had grown tired of killing for a while. And then came the silence. The kind that only shows up when two people have lost too much. He looked at me, and I looked back. For the first time, without fear, without rushing. There was dust on my face, dried blood on my arms. But his eyes saw me like I was made of light. He reached out, and when his hand touched mine, my whole body settled, like it was saying, "Finally." That touch wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was a meeting. And when our faces came close, I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel confused. I felt something that had seemed impossible in that war story. Peace. His lips tasted like survival. His arms, still weak, wrapped around me like holding something sacred. And the sheet we shared became an altar. We didn't say big words, just small promises tucked inside the silence. He traced my face with his fingers like memorizing it. And he whispered, "You're gonna be a mother, Bee." I smiled. "I don't even know if I'll be alive next week." He closed his eyes. "You will, because the world needs someone like you a little longer." We slept there, cramped, dirty, protected only by that folded sheet. I don't know if the world paused that night, or if it was just us pausing inside it. All I know is that I woke up to the song of a little bird and the smell of mud drifting in through the half-open door. Joseph was still asleep, his head resting on my lap. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. I just didn't know that would be the last day our lives would still fit inside the same room. When we returned to the infirmary, we acted like everything was normal. He went back to his chair. I went back to the bandages. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't just a nurse in that camp. And he wasn't just another soldier. What happened that night wasn't just love. It was refuge. It was healing. It was a kind of secret the war couldn't burn. But war doesn't like being left out. In the days that followed, the stares grew heavier. The older nurses whispered. A sergeant started calling me by name with a tone that felt too pointed. And Joseph couldn't hide the way he looked at me anymore. Too much tenderness, too much sorrow, too much truth. And in that land where truth was danger, we were about to pay the price. I didn't know it yet, but something inside me had already begun to grow. Another heartbeat, a new story. A bond no one else would ever see, but one I'd never be able to forget. Back then, time was measured in sounds. The siren warning us of bombings. The kettle whistle reminding us to drink something warm, even if it was just water that tasted like rusted iron. The crackling of drying bandages. The rhythm of soldiers' footsteps, even when limping, marching on like the war was yanking them forward by the collar. But inside me, time started ticking differently, in silence, in days that passed without any bleeding. At first I thought it was stress, or maybe the watery food. Lots of women lost their cycle out there. It was common. The body protected itself however it could. But I felt something else, like my center of gravity had shifted. The smell of onion soup turned my stomach. My breasts ached like they were made of stone. And one day, while scrubbing instruments at the end of my shift, a wave of dizziness knocked me off my feet. I played it off. I'd always been good at that. In war, you learn to hide everything. Hunger, rage, tears. But what was growing inside me was harder to hide. And it wasn't just physical. It was a feeling, a strange warmth, a small stubborn light glowing deep in my belly. And every time I walked the corridors and saw wounded soldiers, I'd wonder, will he hear bombs when he grows up? Will he be born into peace or into noise? Joseph didn't know. Not yet. I watched him from afar, reading an old newspaper, trying to walk again with 2 makeshift crutches. His wounds were still raw, but his spirit wasn't. He smiled when a stray cat darted between the tents. He thanked every nurse like it was the first time. And when we crossed paths, he never said anything. He just placed a hand over his heart like saying, "We're still us." In the 3rd week of delay, I went to Lieutenant Matthews. She was older. She could read eyes. Before I said a word, she poured me tea and locked the door. "How many days?" she asked. 24, I answered. She didn't judge, just sighed. "Are you sure who it is?" she whispered. I nodded, tears threatening but held back. "Then what you need now is silence. more than ever. She taught me how to make an herbal tonic, not to end it, that never crossed my mind, but to calm me down. She showed me how to wrap cloth around my waist to hide the growing shape, gave me a wide apron with deep pockets. "It'll last for a while, but not forever," she warned. The body always reveals what we try to bury. I went back to my routine the best I could. But the war story I carried now wasn't in the bandages. It was inside me, and it wounded me in silence. Every time someone called me strong, I wondered what they'd say once they found out. Because back then, a black woman, pregnant on the front lines, was more dangerous than a landmine. Didn't matter that I was a nurse, that I had saved lives. The world wouldn't give me the right to love like that, let alone to carry life from it. And still, every night, before I slept, I spoke to what was growing inside me. In thought, like a prayer, I'd say, "You're mine, just mine. And if you have to be born in the dark, I'll teach you how to find the light." I saved crusts of bread, teaspoons of honey, anything I could stash for survival. I didn't know how long I could hide it, but I was determined. The secret wasn't a burden anymore. It was a flame. Joseph started to notice I was avoiding him, that my body was changing. He never confronted me. But one afternoon, while I was changing the dressing on his shoulder, he took my hand and placed it over his chest. "You seem far away lately, Bee." I took a deep breath, almost told him. But something stopped me. Fear. The promise of silence. The certainty that if he knew, he might try to protect me. And that would be the end of us. The whispers started slowly. First, someone mentioned how tired I looked. Then came the long stare from Sergeant Hoyle, watching how I held the tray against my stomach. And then, the note. A letter, no name, slipped under my pillow. "We know. Take care of what's yours. But remember, there are rules. No signature, no explicit threat. But everything was said. War had eyes, and they were on me. I knew then that my time with that secret was running out. Just a matter of days. Or orders. And war, my daughter. War doesn't ask if you're ready. It just decides." She was small, hunched over, with hair so white it looked like snow had settled inside it. She walked with steady steps, even when the ground shook. Her name was Miss Lillian Carter, but no one dared use the Miss, just Lillian. Too old to fear colonels, too wise to need a rank. She'd been there before me, and would still be there long after we were all gone. I don't know how many soldiers she watched die, or how many she held at the edge of the end. But she had a strange scent to her. A sweet, warm scent. A scent that made me think of home. And what one day I realized. Lillian smelled like milk. She was the one who looked at me for 3 seconds too long when she saw me nauseous in the kitchen. She was the one who handed me a warm cloth and told me to breathe deep without asking questions. And she was the one who, on a random morning, called me to help wash gauze in a zinc bucket and said in the softest voice I've ever heard, "It's not the first time a belly grows in the middle of war, Bee, but maybe it's the first time someone's had the courage to let it grow." I couldn't respond. I just washed. I washed until my fingers wrinkled. Washed until my fear ran down my wrists. And she stood there beside me, unhurried. Like someone not waiting for confession. Just presence. Then she handed me a small bundle. Inside was a thin blanket, folded with the kind of care only grandmother hands can manage. "If it's a boy, cover his feet first. If it's a girl, her chest. The world's crueler to them," she whispered. From that day on, Lillian became my shelter. Never asked for explanations, never judged me. She just gave me mint tea and old instructions. Rub lavender oil on your belly before bed. Drink lemon water in the morning. Listen to your body. It doesn't lie. And in silence, she started shifting my work schedule. Gave me the mornings when the heat wasn't so bad. Made sure I didn't lift heavy things. Let me rest behind the infirmary for 30 minutes. That felt like hours. She taught me how to warm cloth over the stove and lay it on my back to ease tension. Showed me how to press certain points on my feet with my thumbs, like midwives do. But more than anything, she taught me not to be ashamed of what was growing inside me. War wants us to dry up on the inside, Bee. But you're watering life. That's more rebellious than any bomb. What struck me most was how, as my belly grew, the women around me began to look at me differently. Not with judgment, but with memory. Like, for a second, they saw in me the girl they once were, the one who dreamed of being a mother too, before that dream was stripped away by someone else's uniform. One gave me a seashell brooch. Another, a blue ribbon she said belonged to her sister. And one day, someone left a bar of lavender soap on my bed. No note, just the scent of tenderness. Joseph still didn't know, but he was starting to suspect. I saw it in the way he watched me walk. His eyes weren't on my face anymore. They were lower, on my hands, on how I cradled my belly when I thought no one was looking. One day he called me with his eyes, and I went. We sat behind the tent, in the same corner where we used to listen to the piano. He looked at me for a long time, then said, "You don't have to say anything." "I know." And then, "You're not alone." I cried, but not like someone begging for help. I cried like someone who feels seen, like someone who's been found after being lost. He took my hand, placed it over his, and whispered, "If it's a boy, we'll teach him to sing. If it's a girl, we'll teach her to fight." And right there, beneath the worn top and the smoky sky of Italy, I knew the war story I was living wasn't about defeat. It was about resistance, and the rarest kind of courage, choosing love in a world that teaches you to hate. Lillian used to say mothers are made of scraps, a piece of Grandma's patience, a pinch of Auntie's fear, a breath of hope stolen from some old song, and in my case, a silence stitched with war thread. She helped me hide letters, save crusty bread, mark dates on a scrap of fabric sewn into the inner pocket of my apron. "You won't forget the first time he kicks," she told me. And I didn't. It happened on a cold morning. The camp was quiet after a night of rain and gunfire. I was sipping chamomile tea, sitting on a wooden crate. Then, a gentle pressure, like a butterfly inside, like another heartbeat exhaling. My whole body froze. And then, I smiled. For the first time in weeks. I smiled like someone receiving a letter they thought would never come. And Lillian, seeing me smile like that, just nodded with her eyes full of water. "He's here," she said. "He made himself known. Now, everything changes." But what she didn't know, what even I didn't know, was that war is always lurking. And the more beautiful something becomes, the more it prepares to take it. The belly grew. So did the eyes. And the world, which until then had ignored me, suddenly wanted to know too much. The news didn't come like an explosion. It came like everything else in that war. First a subtle noise, then a strange silence. And only then, the blow. It was on a gray morning when the whole camp felt suspended in time that they called me to the supply tent. That was unusual. Nurses weren't normally summoned there alone. Lillian saw me leaving and grabbed my arm. She didn't say a word, just held it tight. Like someone who knows what's coming can't be stopped, only endured. The room was small, smelled of damp paper and mold. There was a scratched wooden table marked by old scalpels, a broken fan, and 2 men. One was Captain Hargrave, a man who never looked me in the eyes but somehow knew every step I took. The other wore a dark uniform and held a black folder in his hands. "Sit down, Adams," the captain said, like my name was some kind of offense. I stayed standing. They didn't waste time. Said they knew that the situation was sensitive, that they recognized my valuable service as a nurse, that they understood the emotional challenges of the war environment. And then, the sentence that hung in the air like a baby tooth, barely holding on. "He cannot be born here." I thought it was a metaphor, but it wasn't. They were clear. My presence on the front was deemed unsafe. I would be removed. But not just that. There was a clause, an unofficial protocol. If I agreed to be quietly transferred to an Allied base in France and to surrender the child for safety and proper care, the matter would be closed. No record, no consequences. My name would remain clean. My position, respected. My reputation, untouched. You'd return a hero, not a problem. I stood there, feeling heat crawl up my neck like a silent fire. My fingers trembled. My knees wanted to give. But something inside me rose. Something older, harder, like a wall built from ancient bones, and whispered prayers. "He's my son," I said. The first time I called him that. Not baby. Not pregnancy. Son. And that word came out of me like a muffled scream, like it had been waiting a long time to be spoken. The man with the folder cleared his throat, said he understood, but repeated, "He can't be born here." As if here wasn't just the camp, but the world. As if there was no space, no language, no right for what I carried. And then I understood. It wasn't the place that bothered them. It was the symbol. The fact that I, a black woman, a nurse, had dared to love where I was only meant to serve. And worse than that, I had dared to create. They gave me 48 hours, handed me a folded note with instructions for the base in Normandy. And one last phrase, delivered with the coldness of someone who wouldn't remember this by nightfall. "Do what's best for everyone." Everyone. Except me. Except him. I walked out like I had crushed glass in my stomach. Lillian was waiting, sitting on a rock by the infirmary tent. When she saw me, she didn't ask anything. She just stood and opened her arms. I folded into them like a child. And I cried. Cried a cry that wasn't just mine. It was for all the women before me who'd been silenced. Erased. Folded into paperwork stamped non-compliant. Joseph found out that night. I didn't have to tell him. I just lay beside him on the burn ward sheets and pressed my forehead to his. He held me, like he already knew. "They'll try to erase it, Bea, but they can't, because you're already a mother, and that they can't take." I stayed there, listening to him breathe, trying to memorize the pitch, the rhythm, the weight of his skin against mine. Like I could tuck every detail into the deepest part of my body, to remember when the world tried to pretend it never happened. He sang to me, a song with no words, just melody, the same one I heard the first time we saw each other. And I felt our child move, like he was dancing, like he was saying, "I hear it too." The next morning my bag was packed. Lillian gave me dry bread, a jar of peanut butter wrapped in newspaper, and a blue sheet with faded flowers. "It's not pretty," she said, "but it smells like being held." I folded it carefully, stitched a small piece of fabric into the lining with my name, and a word I'd embroidered quickly. Isaiah. I don't know where the name came from. It just did. And it came strong, like an answer to everything they tried to silence. As the jeep drove me away from camp, I looked back. The tents, the faces, the quiet piano. And there, between the trees, stood Joseph, holding a dried flower. He didn't wave, just looked, and I looked back. Like we both knew this wasn't a goodbye. It was a suspended promise, an invisible thread that would keep us tied together, even when everything around us screamed no. And deep down, I knew. My son hadn't even been born yet. But they had already tried to erase his story before it ever began. The base in Normandy didn't smell like war. It smelled like absence, like dry laundry on a line with no wind, like floors scrubbed too clean, as if trying to erase any trace of blood or truth. It was a small camp, surrounded by low fences, where the sky felt too big and time at times refused to move. They took me to a lodging tucked in the far corner, where light came in through a single small window covered by a white handkerchief. There was no more war there. But there wasn't much else either. The nurse who received me was German, round-faced with cold hands. Her name was Greta. She didn't speak much, but looked at me with a strange mix of pity and protocol. She handed me 2 dresses, a hairbrush, and a bar of lavender soap that made me nauseous on the spot. After that, they left me alone. There weren't many mirrors in that place, but the foggy glass on the window was enough. I could see my face was thinner, my eyes larger, my belly an entire universe, a whole world, and I was the only one who knew how to speak its language. Labor came in the middle of a rainy night, like the whole world started crying before I did. There was no warning, no doctor, no prayer, just the pain. A deep, burning pain that tore through my body like it was ripping out every secret I'd kept since that first night with Joseph. I screamed softly, not to wake the shadows. I gripped the bed frame until my fingers ached. And just when I thought I wouldn't make it, when I was sure I'd die right there, he came. A soft cry, a brand new sound, a sound no one else seemed to hear. Isaiah. I held him with trembling hands, still covered in blood and possibility. His eyes didn't open right away, but his body breathed. He was small, but whole, warm. And for the first time in my whole war story, I knew what it felt like to hold the world in my hands. I didn't cry. Not then. Because there was a strength inside me that only women who bleed and survive can understand. I was a fortress. And that baby, the secret no one would ever erase. I wrapped him in the blue sheet Lillian gave me. I sang the lullaby my mother used to hum while doing laundry in the backyard. Nana nenem, kia kuka vem pega. And I kissed his forehead with a hunger that came from generations. I wanted to tattoo my scent on him, my skin, my soul. I wanted him to know he was born from love, even if the world tried to convince him otherwise. But time in war doesn't belong to us. It belongs to papers, to orders, to those who decide who gets to stay. When Greta walked in, her face was harder. Time, was all she said. I didn't answer. I just pulled Isaiah close to my chest. 1 more minute. She hesitated, then nodded. 1 minute. 60 seconds to close a story that should have never had a deadline. I counted his fingers, touched his feet, ran the tip of my nose across his cheek. Then, with the finest needle I could find in my bag, I stitched into the lining of the sheet a name. Isaiah Adams. Crooked letters, pale blue thread, and below it, 1 word I never said aloud, but screamed with every stitch. Love. Greta held out her arms. I didn't hand him over. I laid Isaiah on the pillow, still damp with my quiet tears, and said, "Take care of him like you'd take care of me, because he's all I have." She didn't reply, just took the pillow gently and walked out. I stayed there, hands empty, body still warm from birth. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the pale walls gold. It was a new day, but for me, it was an ending. In that narrow bed, in that field forgotten by maps and men, I left the world. Not just my son, the whole world. Because from that moment on, everything would be lived in silence. They gave me a bath, dressed me, put me in a jeep with wooden benches, and sent me back to the United States with an envelope in my bag and a new identity in my records. Service completed with distinction. But the real distinction, my daughter, was surviving without losing my mind. Isaiah was taken with no destination, no birth certificate, no face. And still he stayed with me. Every time I saw a boy playing on the sidewalk, every time someone asked if I had children, every time a lullaby played on the old radio, he stayed. Not as pain, but as presence, as breath, as a name stitched into the bottom of a sheet I never used again. The war pushed me home like it was trying to get rid of me. No letter, no clear destination, just a one-way ticket stamped "Duty fulfilled." They handed me a small medal, dull and cold, that read, "Honorable Service, Allied Medical Front." I held it between my fingers like cracked glass. Honorable. That word hurt, because there was no honor in coming back with an empty womb and a heart throbbing for something no one would ever acknowledge. I arrived in Baltimore on a spring morning. Trees were blooming, the newspapers spoke of the war's end, and neighbors let loose their smiles like kites. But inside me, it was winter, and it was silent. I settled into a modest house inherited from a distant aunt in the West Baltimore neighborhood. Cobblestone street, small windows, a roof that groaned when the wind picked up. It was all I had. And in that house, with walls still smelling of old wood and the mildew of being forgotten, I learned how to live without asking. Living in silence isn't the same as forgetting. It's repeating gestures no one understands. It's covering an empty chair with a sheet no one else sees. It's leaving an extra slice of bread on the table without thinking. I went back to nursing at a local hospital. Traded tents for polished floors, the groans of soldiers for the sighs of old men dying slowly. Everyone thought I was strong, that the war had turned me into stone. But no one saw that. Inside, I was made of stitched linens and muffled memory. I never married, never had other children. The men who tried to get close thought I was sweet at first, then strange. "You don't talk much about yourself," they'd say. And I'd smile, like someone grateful for not being found out. I had my rituals. Every Friday I'd light a white candle in the kitchen and play a song on the radio. Jazz, if I could. I'd sit in the straw chair, apron still in my lap, and wait. Not for anyone, but for a time that never came back. As the years passed, I learned how to hide grief in small details. The blue sheet I folded until it looked like just fabric. The embroidered name I covered with lace. The faded photograph. Tucked between pages of a book, a boy with faceless eyes. A cry only I could still hear when the world was asleep. And cruelest of all, the lack of questions. Because no one asked. No one wanted to know if Bernice had left anything behind. After the war, people wanted parties, not ghosts. One day I got a letter, yellowed paper, an envelope stamped from a military adoption agency. It informed me that the records of the child born in March of 1945 had been sealed in accordance with identity protection policies. No name, no clue, nothing. Just silence rubber stamped by the government. I tucked that letter deep in my sewing box. Never read it again. Because reading it again would be like ripping the stitches from a wound that no longer had skin. Still, my war story kept visiting me. In dreams, in sensory flashbacks, in the smell of ether, the clink of instruments, the muffled sound of footsteps at night. Sometimes when I'd rest my head against the kitchen window, I'd hear it, faint like a whisper, the sound of that old piano Moonlight serenade. And with it, Joseph's voice. Not singing, just saying my name. B. Then silence. But not just any silence. A silence with shape, with weight, with a name. People ask me sometimes if it was worth it. Serving, surviving, coming back. And I never know how to answer. Because what gets lost in war isn't just flesh or time. It's identity. And in my case, it was also the right to tell my own story. I became what they wanted me to be. Discreet, useful, resilient. And in return, they gave me silence as payment. A long silence. So long I sometimes forgot the sound of my own voice when I whispered his name. Isaiah. And yet, that same silence, over time, taught me how to listen to other women, other nurses, other mothers who were never allowed to be called mothers. Every time one of them spoke of something she lost, I understood without needing translation, because those who've been erased recognize in the in-between what goes unsaid. And there, in the quiet between stitches, shifts, and whispered words, I began sowing something new. Resistance. Today my neighbors know me as Miss Bernice on the corner. They think I'm just another old lady living off memories. They don't know I was a nurse in the war, that I gave up a child, that I survived 3 deaths, war, childbirth, and being forgotten. They don't know, and that's okay, because one day maybe someone will find the sheet, read the name, and understand that there was love there, even in the silence. It had been decades since I'd hung up my nurse's coat for the last time. My body no longer obeyed the way it used to. My hands trembled just holding a spoon, let alone a pair of forceps. But every now and then, when the local hospital called for help, emergencies, staff shortages, I went. Not out of pride, not out of nostalgia, but out of a quiet duty to those of us forged in the heat of something that never really stopped burning. A nurse doesn't retire from instinct. She just learns how to hide the urgencies deep in her chest. That day they called because there had been a fire on the east side of town. An old building swallowed in flames, several injured. The ER was overflowing, the doctors overwhelmed, and they reached out even to those long forgotten from the list. I didn't think twice. I slipped on my old apron over my clothes, tied my hair back like I used to in the 40s, though now it was all white, soft, and coiled like cotton. But as soon as I stepped into the room, the smell stopped me cold. Burned flesh again. That scent I had buried with the blue sheet, the one I tried to forget inside recipes and pill schedules. But there it was, alive as ever. For a moment I wanted to walk out, but then I heard a groan, a familiar sound, not the voice but the tone of pain. And I moved closer. The young man was lying there, bandaged from shoulder to hip. Part of his face burned, skin grafts on his arms still fresh, but his eyes were those of someone who'd seen too much and was still searching for something. I opened his chart, and my hands froze. Langston, DM, 24 years old, firefighter. And below that, a note. Son of Joseph Langston Sr., Alabama. Langston. I read that name like I was reading my own heart aloud. My stomach twisted. My legs lost their grip. I sat beside the bed. He was sedated but breathing strong. His features were familiar. The jawline, the shape of the mouth. But what struck me most was his silence. Even unconscious, he carried a calm I hadn't seen in years. The same calm Joseph used to carry after he sang. I stayed there for hours, monitoring vitals, changing dressings, whispering softly, as if he could hear. And inside me, something stirred. Not hope, not joy, but something bittersweet. Like lemon and honey in tea when you're running a fever. A desperate need to know more, and a fear of knowing too much. What if it was him? What if Isaiah had returned to that name? What if the world, in all its crooked, mysterious ways, was trying to give me back what it once stole? At the end of my shift, I handed over the chart to the front desk and asked, as casually as I could, "Does this Langston have any family nearby?" The woman nodded. His mother was on her way. His father was still in Alabama, old now, in fragile health. "He's the grandson of Joseph Langston, a war vet. Can you believe it?" she said. "They say his grandfather used to sing to patients." My body tensed, like a sheet of ice had slid under my skin. Joseph hadn't just survived. He had children, and grandchildren, and maybe, just maybe, Isaiah was one of them, or was him. But how could I know? How could I ask? How do you reopen a war story sealed in iron without being swallowed by everything, holding it shut? That night I went home with my head spinning. I sat in my straw chair, lit a candle, and pulled out the box from the back of the dresser. The same light wood box, its lid cracked, smelling of time. Inside was still the sheet, the name stitched in blue, and the lock of hair tied to a yellowed scrap of paper. I held them like fragments of an old map, a map leading back to something that had never really left. In the days that followed, I went back to the hospital whenever I could. The young man, Daniel, began to wake up. His eyes opened slowly. The first thing he said was, "Is there music playing?" I smiled. "Not right now." And he said, "Then I must be imagining it. My granddad used to say that when things got hard, you'd hear music inside." I almost dropped the tray. I sat down beside him. "What did he sing?" I asked. And Daniel, his voice still scratchy, replied, "Old stuff. Glenn Miller sometimes. Moonlight something." That's when I knew. The music had returned, and with it, maybe, the chance to close a loop, or reopen a door that never should have been shut. But I still needed to know if it was him. If Daniel was Isaiah, if his blood was mine too. And the only thing I had was the sheet, a name stitched into wartime fabric. And hope, that stubborn, fragile thing, that maybe, just maybe, something in Daniel would recognize it, even if he didn't know why. In my room on top of the dresser, there's a box no one ever opens. It's small, made of lightwood, its corners worn down by time, and a thin crack on the lid, like a discreet scar. I keep it there like one keeps a shrine, with respect, with distance, with reverence. No one asks about it, and I never explain. But today, as the sunset filters through the lace curtain, I realize it might be time to speak. This box came with me from Belgium. I don't know how it survived all the transfers, the relocations, the bombings. Maybe it stayed intact because of what it carries, the secret. Inside are fragments of a time that no longer exists, a piece of the uniform I wore on the hospital train, a handkerchief that's lost its scent but still carries moisture at the edges, a small lock of hair tied to a yellowed scrap of paper and stitched with pale blue thread at the bottom of the box. A name, Isaiah Adams. The letters are slightly crooked now, pulled tight by the tension of the fabric. The thread's faded in places, but it's still legible. Below the name, a word I embroidered but never dared say out loud. Love. It was with this sheet that I wrapped my son for the first time. It was with this fabric that I whispered to him in the dark of Normandy what I was never allowed to say out loud to the world, that he was mine, that he was loved, and that the silence that came after wasn't a choice. It was the condition. I placed the box on my lap, opened it slowly, like someone uncovering a body they hadn't seen in years. And for the first time in so long, I smelled the past, as if it was still warm. I remembered the night of the birth, the song I sang, the sound of Greta's boots entering, the weight of the pillow as she carried him away. All of it came back, like a film with no sound, just images, just ache. That evening I walked to the hospital. Daniel was still recovering, sitting in a wheelchair with a blanket on his lap. He was reading a book. When he saw me, he smiled. "You came back," he said, and I replied, "I never really left." I sat beside him, the box resting in my arms. I didn't say anything, just placed it on the table. He looked at it, curious. "Yours?" I nodded. "Want to open it?" I did. He saw the handkerchief first, then the piece of uniform, the lock of hair, and last, the sheet. I unrolled it with trembling hands, turned it inside out, showed him the name. "That was my son's name," I whispered. Daniel went quiet. He read it, ran his fingers over the letters like he was touching an old prayer. "Isaiah Adams," he said softly. "My mom. She told me that name was on the original birth certificate. They changed it later." My eyes filled with tears. "Did she ever tell you anything else?" I asked. He nodded. "She said she found me at a military shelter, that I was left there shortly after birth, that someone wrapped me in a blue floral sheet and disappeared." He looked again at the fabric. "She never knew your name, but she said sometimes she heard your voice in my dreams, like I'd heard it before." I sat there, not knowing what to do with my hands, or my heart. I felt time stop, as if everything I'd held inside all these years now stood before me, alive and breathing. He looked at me and said, "I don't know who you are, but I feel at home around you, since the first day. I didn't ask for a test, didn't need confirmation, because in that moment, every part of me already knew. It was like my womb, even old, soft, empty, had recognized him. Like my cells still remembered. Like the war story I had buried in my chest had finally found its last page. He took the sheet, folded it carefully, and handed it back to me. "You keep it," he said. "You've held it for so long. Now, tell me the story." So I did, from the beginning. There are silences heavier than any scream, and there are war stories that don't live in books, medals, or museum walls. They live at the bottom of old wooden boxes, in names stitched with blue thread, in lullabies that return out of nowhere, on quiet nights when the soul forgets to pretend. For so long I kept Isaiah's story, as if it wasn't allowed to exist, not because I wanted to forget it, but because they made me believe that love born in war was a mistake meant to be buried with the uniforms. But now I know. No love needs hiding. No child deserves to be erased. And every woman who gave birth in silence carries within her a whole book the world hasn't read yet. Today, when I look at that sheet, the same one that held Isaiah for just a few minutes, I understand he never stopped being my son, even without calling me mother, even without knowing my name. The love we stitch, even in the dark, doesn't unravel. It keeps humming between the seams like a melody only two hearts can recognize. The same song Joseph used to sing. The same lullaby I whispered alone in a forgotten tent in northern France. The same tune I heard again, 70 years later, in the eyes of a young man named Daniel. If you made it here with me, if you listened to this story like sitting beside an old friend, I thank you. Not just for hearing it, but for having the courage not to look away. Because stories like this one aren't about the past. They're still happening. In nursing homes, in silences, in kitchens where grandmothers let their coffee go cold, staring at a photograph no one else remembers. In mothers who gave their children away so they could live, even if it meant dying while still breathing. I ask you this. If this war story touched you, share it. Not for me, but for all the Bernices who still haven't found their voice. For all the Isaiahs who grew up not knowing how deeply they were loved, and for every woman who once carried the whole world inside and had to pretend it wasn't there. Comment if you'd like. Tell me your story, or someone else's. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this, with truth, with quiet, with soul, subscribe here to the channel. Here, every story is honored like a legacy, and every name, no matter how small, is stitched with love. Now you can turn off the light, or just leave the lamp on. I'll stay here a little longer, looking at the sheet, because it still holds the exact weight of a newborn.